Alright, so this is going to be my review for the myth of Helter Skelter. As many people believe, I, too, do not feel like this book was written by Susan Atkins. I don't believe Susan had very much input into the book at all. I have my doubts as to whether the opening letter from Susan was really from her either. It was dated 2005, though we have no proof of this being a real letter from her, and it is easy to date any letter with any date, if you don't have to show a physical copy of it. While I believe that people have sent her hateful letters in prison and even more lauded her for the crimes that she did, the book's tonal difference from the first one makes it all very unbelievable for me. It is well known by now that Susan's second husband, and the one she spent the rest of her life with, was a Harvard lawyer graduate that fought for her release until the day she died. Considering the story of the couple, I don't doubt that her husband, James Whitehouse, loved her. But it is clear that his judgment was clouded when it came to the parole board and the details of the crime events. It's actually disappointing to me that this book only talked about Charles Manson, since this book came out after Susan died and was supposedly worked on in the final years before her death. Since her first book came out 30 years before, in 1977, I was hoping that there was going to be more talk about her life in prison, various things that could have gone on, and maybe even a potential apology. But, of course not. The book isn't even really a book, but an elongated essay. There are chapters that are laughably short, and none of them are honestly too long. I was able to read half the book in one sitting to myself. This isn't necessarily a detraction in the material, as of course there's many pieces of short books that you can read, such as Night by Elie Wiesel, which comes to mind. But the way this material was written, it doesn't come off as a book or a novel, or honestly even a vignette. It is like, honestly, a high school senior or a college freshman's essay that most definitely would not have been graded well. Just from the grammatical errors alone, this essay probably would have gotten a C, at the most. There's definite grammar errors in the book, which is honestly appalling to me considering that her husband was a Harvard graduate. And if Susan really wrote the book, I would have thought that James Whitehouse, the Harvard graduate, would have really pored over and, would have looked over, for grammatical and spelling errors. Though, we don't really know how well James did in school either. In my copy, which was the digital version of the book from Amazon, there were so many instances of the wrong words used, whether it was in the wrong tense or just completely odd wording to have at all. I felt troubled reading these errors because I didn't want to sound uneducated myself when reading the book to you guys, but at the same time too, it's not up to me to correct the inconsistencies in someone's work, especially when the book has been out for almost a decade. It was released in 2012, and as of right now, it's 2021. All of these grammatical errors make Atkins and Whitehouse's arguments hard to take seriously when the Harvard graduate couldn't seem bothered to proofread his work or hire some sort of editor to do it for him. I do want to keep an open mind, though, because sometimes different versions and copies and printings of books can have errors that are actually no fault of the author's own. Personally, I once had a short story published in a contest back when I was in high school. Despite proofreading and spell checking my little prose short story and going over it with my teacher multiple times, who refused to send in our submissions unless it was 100% correct grammatically, when my piece of prose was published in the little magazine, there were plenty of errors from whoever retyped up my piece. And it was actually pretty annoying and disappointing to see that, because I know that I had done everything right. Sometimes it is other people that do things wrong. Next, of course, would be the arguments themselves in the book. The literature definitely portrays itself as an essay, as each chapter is more like a contention and an argument, as opposed to segmented pieces of a story. Like I said before, I didn't think this whole entire book would be talking about Charles Manson, and it is disappointing even further with the flimsy arguments that it makes. The book relies on insulting character flaws within Manson without acknowledging those in Susan Atkins herself. Just like Tex Watson's book, there is the common theme of blaming other people. This has nothing to do with me. The information here is even less valuable than what many think of Helter Skelter by Vincent Bugliosi. While the modern technology can show what Bugliosi got wrong in Helter Skelter, there is at least some value in that book, even if there are certain discrepancies that can make certain things incorrect. On the other hand, though, the myth of Helter Skelter doesn't provide us with anything new. No new information, no new pictures of Susan or her co-defendants. It makes the whole thing appear as a cash grab, despite it being made by her husband, of all people. One of the stupidest parts of the story is where Whitehouse tries to make it seem so virtuistic that Susan didn't ask for immunity for anything in the trial. Whether Susan wrote this part of the book or not, it is completely bitter sounding, and obviously someone was very jealous that Linda Kasabian was able to get complete immunity for her testimony. Trying to construe the story in a way where we're supposed to think of Susan Atkins as some pious, God-loving, pure Christian girl that so patriotically didn't ask for anything in the trial doesn't make her righteous for not asking for immunity. But rather, it only shows her own stupidity for not protecting herself from the law. It shows that Susan didn't take the whole thing seriously and very really believed that she could have gotten out someday. Linda Kasabian wasn't an evil monster for getting immunity. Susan Atkins was a moron for not asking for it. It is very odd. The end of the book goes on to stomp on Linda Kasabian. First of all, I don't understand why, after 40 years in prison, Susan, as we're supposed to believe who wrote the book, would now feel the need to crap on Linda Kasabian's reputation. I feel like that would have made more sense for her to have done in her first book when she was more freshly locked up. In a weird way, maybe that goes to show Susan didn't feel the need to talk about other people like that once she found religion. This part of the book was most definitely written by her husband, as Susan really didn't speak ill of any of the family members at all in her first book. What's interesting to me is how the book doesn't focus so heavily on other members of the group like it does on Linda Kasabian and Charles Manson. It only very briefly talks about the Hinman murders and Bobby Beausoleil, which is because it fits into their narrative of everything happening at Te La Bianca because Manson shot Bernard Crowe. It very briefly talks of an encounter Susan had with Leslie Van Houten years later in prison, where Leslie apologized for hating Susan for years because she believed that Susan didn't love her baby, a belief that stemmed from Manson's ideology of keeping mothers from their children. It sounded like a story that I could believe, yet the theme of the story makes me wonder if it was partially construed. While I feel like there is a great possibility that maybe some of the girls made amends in prison, the story was a sort of piece of evidence used by White House to 1. Prove that Susan really loved her child and she regretted losing him, and 2. That she only lost custody of her child because it was Manson's fault and he got in the way of her parenting. Once again, this and all other points in the book are just fingers that point back to Manson, instead of having Atkins own up to any guilt. It's funny, actually, this book shifts the blame even more than the first one, where in Child of Satan, Child of God, Susan just omitted things. Or she would at least retrospectively admit to not being the best. The myth takes essentially one line from Child of Satan, where Susan said her son was the best thing in her life, and ran with it. The myth seems like it has to prove something, one of them being that Susan was a loving mother who missed her child and pined for him deeply. The more the book tries to prove this, the less apt I am to believe it. The book as a whole succumbs to this pitfall where it uses the literary mechanism of repetition to emphasize a point, but the way it's cut and pasted together lowers the reading level, and for me it baffles that that this could at least be partially the work of an Ivy League Harvard graduate. It makes you think about the true intentions of James Whitehouse, who used his deceased wife as the front of the book and made it appear very poorly that this second book was all her work. I feel like the reader is supposed to think that Susan said this story out loud while James wrote it all down. Honestly, it was probably the opposite. The story as a whole comes off as an essay that would have been an argument for her release. I do wonder if it was supposed to be something to use in her parole hearings, but Susan didn't make it that far. I wonder if any of these arguments were used before, while she was still alive, which honestly would explain why she was never granted any sort of parole. Despite the author's note in the book that they used a few pieces of Manson literature to quote certain statements or prove certain things, I don't feel like any of these sources were used enough like they should have. And when they quoted it, it really wasn't a complete reference. The main one that comes to mind is Tex Watson's book, which I read after this one, and his book isn't actually referenced enough to prove the myth's point either way. And finally, there is the main point of the book. The myth of Helter Skelter only seems to exist to prove that the Te La Bianca murders were just a string of bad events to cover up Manson's false belief of killing Bernard Crowe. To say that multiple innocent people were murdered, including an unborn child, just because Charles Manson thought he killed a black guy, just trivializes all those that were killed and the situation as a whole. Whitehouse proves that they have no respect for their fellow humans by trying to shift complete blame on Tex Watson and Charles Manson. Susan makes the claim that she never killed Sharon Tate, perhaps at the most maybe only stabbing her, depending on which day and which story that you hear. This is one thing that actually is consistent with Child of Satan, where Susan claimed that she didn't kill Sharon Tate, and Tex Watson claims this in his book also. But it still doesn't help, though, that Susan lied about killing Sharon Tate in the past, and the myth claims that she only lied to Ronnie Howard and Virginia Graham because they were homosexuals, and she wanted to get them off her back. Which, of course, is completely laughable, because that was clearly using Susan's religion as a defense, despite not having found God at that time she was at Sybil Brand. And Manson's group usually consisting of women touching each other since there weren't enough men. At least according to Paul's book, which, honestly, you don't even need to read his book to know that. This point in particular is such an eye roll because it wasn't even mentioned in the first book, and once again makes the argument in the book as a whole unbelievable. There are recollections from the first book that weren't described in full in this one. The way Susan met Manson and left San Francisco with him for some reason didn't mention all the details from the first book, such as not even naming Ella Jo Bailey. This isn't a huge detraction within itself, but I found it kind of odd when the book tries to focus on other things, such as Linda Kasabian and Charles Manson's personalities. The constant argument Charles Manson was trying to cover up his shooting of Bernard Crowe by forcing Bobby Beausoleil to kill Gary Hinman, and that the Tate murders were only payback for Manson killing Crowe, but the LaBianca murders were only done because Tex hadn't killed at the Tates properly. I mean, all of this as a whole is childish. It just doesn't make sense. None of it absolves Atkins of guilt, nor does it make her look any better. There seems to be a ploy here in making her look like someone who was just along for the ride, which, if true, does not help her case at all. If she was just there and yet went in the car to kill the LaBiancas, which we know she did, she is guilty of not telling the authorities of the first murders. In fact, this book, and Child of Satan, doesn't mention her previous crimes in large at all. Child of Satan only mentions her stint with Al in Oregon as something more like a tryst of where she was a hunky-dory girl going along for a ride. In reality, Atkins had threatened the Oregon cops with killing them, but she didn't mention that. Once again, omissions in the story, whether it was from Susan directly or from James Whitehouse in this book. This is not a good book, and I wouldn't recommend it in any way. It doesn't provide any new information, whether from Susan's life in prison or before prison. The contentions throughout the argumental essay are junior high at best, and they barely even reference the source material that they claim to. I don't regret spending my time or money on it because it was actually so hilariously stupid and pretty easy to see through. I just don't understand, though, why James Whitehouse didn't just put his name on the cover as the main author instead of Susan's. I mean, we know why, because Susan's name would draw, attention and money, but this falls flat so easily as these arguments cannot be presented properly. I think it's ironic that in Child of Satan, Child of God, Susan claimed that she learned to love writing through her education with Carleen Faith. In The Myth, the book's tone and style of writing is a complete departure from the first. This is enough for anyone to see that the writers are different, and it causes the whole material to become suspicious. Because of Susan's liking towards writing, I really expected her to have written another book herself, at least about her experiences. I should have known that was not a possibility at all. As weird as it may seem, I would have liked a continuation to her prison story, maybe even a mention of Donald Lee Lazier and her marriage to James Whitehouse. I was curious if she ever got that hysterectomy. I wondered if she ever had all her teeth pulled out, like all the doctors said she needed. It would have been interesting to have known these events of her life story, as opposed to weird and poorly constructed contentions that prove nothing. James Whitehouse could have made more money, I think, just writing a book about how he married a killer or someone in the Manson family. Or, in an ironic sense of words, how he married a lifer. This aspect of Susan's life would have been more interesting to read, as many people, myself included, are surprised that she was able to marry, divorce, then remarry, and have conjugal visits with each other in prison. The only thing that this book proved was that Susan Atkins was right where she belonged, in prison.